Who out there remembers New Kids on the Block? Well, good, because today we're talking about New Kids in Town. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the show. So glad to see you all once again. And if you're new here, thank you for stopping by. I think that you're going to enjoy the show that you're about to see because this is the place where we talk about cartoons and shows that we grew up on as kids and talk about them today. Which today we're talking about the Superman episode New Kids in Town, which originally aired on October 1st, 1998.
I didn't know what to do, so I called the Legion of Superheroes.
Now, this is a fun episode that introduces the Legion of Superheroes to the Superman, the animated series universe. And they're a fun group of characters that has been sprinkled throughout the comics and TV shows. And I think they've made appearances in almost about every iteration of Superman, at least. But a lot of DC iterations that they made. But we'll talk all about that right after our 60-second rundown, Brainiac Bomb rundown of the episode. Let's see if I can give you a synopsis of the episode in 60 seconds or less. Here we go. In the future, Brainiac is trying to do something on this ship and is able to open up this portal and goes through it. And then the captain of the ship calls in the Legion of Superheroes to investigate this. And they go, well, there's only one way to find out where or when he went. Let's jump through it. So they jump through it. They end up in Smallville when Clark Kent was a teenager. And they remember from their a briefing and tapes that Superboy Clark Kent is about to become Superman and Brainiac must be there to destroy him. So they find Brainiac and them find Clark at this dance with Lana, and they fight and he gets away, and then he beats up some bullies, and they're trying to convince Clark Kent that they're on his side, and so they end up at Clark's farm because Brainiac is there to try to stop Clark Kent, and they fight and they have a big battle, and Superboy Clark Kent realizes that he has these powers, and then they set everything right in the town by convincing everybody with their superpowers. This is the wrap-up. We're right into the wrap-up. They convince everybody in the town with their superpowers that it was a tornado that went through, and Clark Kent goes, why? This is weird. You're going to be able to convince everybody of that. And they go, well, you're the same. And they mind control him and are able to convince him that this never happened. And they fly off, and I guess he eventually becomes Superman. Still.
You're lucky you're still in one piece, son.
This episode starts off like the year 29 something or other. And it immediately gets me excited because this is what is so great about Superman, the animated series, and what they were able to open up by doing this show is all these fun sci-fi elements. Not only can we travel to other galaxies or deal with aliens or other species or be able to tell stories based on that, but we're also able to go forward or back in time and kind of utilize those components into some of the great storytelling. And this is an example of that we start out in the future with Brainiac, which is already an established character, and then we introduce the Legion of Superheroes and tie them into the story, and then it all takes place back in the past of the continuity of what we're used to, of Superman being an adult in Metropolis. We see him as Clark Kent, as a boy. He's at a point in his life where he's learning of his powers, but doesn't quite know all the capability that he has. And we play this story out. And I think that's such a great opportunity, and utilizing the differences of Superman or the context of the Superman universe versus Batman, and being able to tell just a fun story. And I think what also makes sense about that is that the Legion of Superheroes was originally introduced in the Superboy comic. And Superboy, for a long time in the storylines of and comic titles of the Legion of Superheroes, was always kind of their mentor or their sort of leader kind of person. And so I think, they certainly could have just as easily brought them into the world of Superman now. But the writers cleverly brought these characters back to the past to deal with Clark Kent and told a story that way. And what's also fun is that we get another glimpse into Clark Kent's history. Sure, we all know the story of him growing up and discovering his powers and moving off to Metropolis and those kind of things. And we saw it certainly in the original trilogy of the series. But here's kind of an interesting segment of his life where he knows he has powers and maybe doesn't quite know how to control them, as he threw that bully across the room, but is discovering that something's kind of different about him, but is still trying to learn how to be an adult or growing up, but also with these super abilities and what that means for his life. And we get to see kind of the relationship elements of him and Lana. And we also get to see him before he becomes the hero that we know him as now, as Superman, running headfirst into danger. But we get to see him at this point a little leery, a little scared. And even when the Legion of Superheroes are there and telling him, here's what's going on, and here's why Brainiac is trying to stop you, and he's trying to prevent you from ever becoming Superman, Superboy just takes off running and ends up going back home.
It wasn't like this in the history tapes.
So it's stories like this that I think work really well, because we kind of stripped away some of the heroic elements of Superman because he's just a boy, a teenager, and we get to see him before that. But there's a great moment in this episode that we are able to see him become more of a hero when his father is threatened by Brainiac and his robot minions or whatnot. We see Superboy get angry and jump towards the farm equipment and picks it up and smashes it. That we get to see him embodying his powers and that rooted, that heroic element that's rooted in him start to peek out. And it makes for a great moment because it wasn't expected, because we saw Clark Kent running from danger previous, and now he's put into a crisis and he has to answer that call.
Guess the history tapes weren't so far off after all.
And I'm always fascinated when you bring new characters into a story, and these aren't brand new. I mean, they've obviously been around for a while, but there's a large history and a lot of information about the Legion of Superheroes would be very challenging to cram into one episode or this episode. And the creative ways of being able to give the needed information to the audience without taking a turn for just a lot of exposition, but also making it interesting. And I thought the way that they introduced these characters into the episode of coming down in Smallville or just outside of Smallville on that farm, and the farmer holding them up, you must be those kids that have been wrecking my fields, that they're able to real quickly establish sort of what their powers are and get their names out to the audience without overtly going, I'm Cosmic Boy and here's what I can do. They're quickly able to establish who these characters are and then let the rest go. And I think that the episode plays out in such a way that you can tell that there's more to these characters and more to this group. And even when they're kind of mind melding with, that's a Star Trek thing, when they're mind melding with Clark and showing him what the future looks like, they do this pan of this room and you get to see a bunch of the other superheroes. And, I don't know what all their names are, but I can see the images of these other characters and go, oh yeah, that's the rest of the group. So they allude to this bigger story, almost a tease, if you will, of what else is out there for these characters. But I didn't feel like it bogged down the episode to make it feel like we've got to explain all this. So in that sense, it felt very much like their own episode. And this could have certainly been a spring-off point or a testing ground for another spin-off series of them. It would have been cool to have that then. Maybe that was too adventurous and Justice League was a more obvious choice. But this could have served as a what did they call that? A spin-off episode. But it would have worked really well because it features them very prominently. And our star performer of Superman is Tim Daly speaking for Superman. And he's not in this episode at all. We have Jason Marsden speaking for Clark Kent, and for teenage Clark Kent, that is. And we don't even get to hear Tim Daly at all. We get to see Superman in one moment where they transform into him, but it's very much their episode, and Clark Kent's even more of a supporting character in the story.
Well, it's just as well. I don't know how I'd explain any of it.
So when it comes time to rank this episode, it's a lot of fun. And I think that this is the type of story that I've been retrospectively asking for 20 years later. But this is the type of story that I think matches the environment of Superman. It's not so much about coming up with a villain that can go toe-to-toe with Superman, although Brainiac is a great villain for that. But it's a story kind of wrapped around this sci-fi element of time travel and dealing with Clark Kent in the past that makes it interesting and fun. And using these other characters to kind of spice up the story a little bit and forming a partnership with Clark Kent and getting to delve into Clark Kent's story a little bit is a lot of fun. So for all those reasons, I have it falling at the number 10 spot. It squeaked in just into the top 10 spots of my favorite episodes so far. And really, it's a solid episode, and I don't really have a lot of negative things to say about it. I guess it can be a bit of a negative that Superman himself is not technically in this episode, but it still makes for a great fun episode. But I'm finding that this top 10 list that I have forming right now is pretty solid. So it takes a lot to be able to get an episode higher up in that list. So this one falls just below Solar Power. And I think really Solar Power was just a very surprisingly good episode. When they were setting up the Luminous character prior to that, I didn't have a lot of hope for, and that episode was pretty far down on the list, but he made for an interesting character, and again, introduced a lot of these fun sci-fi elements. But I do have this beating out Blast from the Past because, again, not by a huge stretch, but this episode with the Legion of Superheroes, I just found it more interesting and more engaging, and those characters allude to a bigger world that I think was more engaging is the best way I can describe it over Blast from the Past. So what do you think of the Legion of Superheroes? Do you think this was a great depiction of those characters in the episode? Do you think they introduced them well? Or do you think that this kind of ended up being a throwaway episode for them? They could have told a better story featuring those characters. Let me know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this episode, please click the like button. If you want to see more episodes like this, all you have to do is hit subscribe because I have new episodes coming out every Tuesday and Thursday. And next up, I have the episode Obsession, so you don't want to miss that. As always, thank you so much for watching. I'm Andy Knode, and I'll see you soon.